Welcome to Eighth House Portal. As some of us prepare for the month of love, I've decided to take a moment away from releasing the old self, put that topic to the side for now, and let all the information absorb. For the upcoming month of love, where many are told to buy chocolates and flowers, and by the way, there is nothing wrong with chocolates and flowers, I wanted to go a bit deeper, of course. So, this episode, I wanted to dip my toes into the world of the wounded heart and fear of being too much, too emotional, too intense in love, too sexual, too needy, too deep. As a Pisces sun in the eighth house and a lot of fire in my astrological natal chart, I know this terrain very well. So I tried to dive into this topic a bit more, hopefully to understand myself a bit more, and for anyone else that feels that they are in the same situations and have the same themes in their life, hopefully this will help you as well. Now, of course, as I'm not an astrologer, but I'm trying to learn, all right? So where do I go to find out more about myself? I go to my natal chart, and just looking and understanding the astrology of certain aspects in my chart, there was definitely a confirmation of certain things that I seek in another person. So having a shared path is what came up. Going beyond surface connection is an absolute must for me. Falling in love being very rare for me. And there has to be truth, meaning, growth, adventure, and definitely a spiritual connection. I won't go into any more of my chart, but because there's loads more, but what struck me most was how some aspects affirmed my lived experience while others kind of brought into focus traits of myself that remain largely unexamined, I guess. So if anyone wants to find out more about themselves, I always say getting a natal chart reading is probably a good idea. You'll understand more about who you are, and also how the world sees you. So when I mention the term the wounded heart, what does that mean? So in mainstream psychology, the wounded heart, it's not like a diagnosis, formal diagnosis. It's not something you're going to find in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. You won't find it there. It's just a metaphor that people use to explain like a deep emotional or relational injury, usually happening after a loss or rejection, betrayal, neglect, chronic invalidation. Carl Jung talks about not the wounded heart. He uses something called a complex, basically a cluster of painful memories and emotions that get easily triggered, and also describes attachment wounds, which I'll go into a bit later on. There's also something called broken heart syndrome, Takotsubo cardiomyopathy. Some of you may have heard of this. It's a temporary heart condition where there's an intense emotional, physical stress that causes a sudden weakening of the heart's main pumping chamber being the left ventricle. It can feel like an actual heart attack, but without any blocked coronary arteries. So what's actually happening, there's an extremely stressful event, okay? Then the body releases a surge of this stress hormone, so adrenaline, a powerful stress hormone, gets released by the adrenal glands, and that happens when the brain senses danger or intense emotion, and it prepares the body to act fast, fight, flight, or freeze. It increases a person's heart rate, blood pressure, respirations, and it also sends more blood to the muscles. It helps sharpen your focus, and it also releases sugar for that quick energy to help your body survive short-term danger. And that happens within seconds, and it peaks in minutes, and it clears from the bloodstream within about, it can take anywhere from 20 to 60 minutes. Then you have another stress hormone, noradrenaline, and that will help the body to stay alert, focused, ready to respond, increases alertness and attention, and concentration, increases blood pressure, it tightens the blood vessels, and it directs the blood to vital organs. It also sustains that stress response after the adrenaline spikes. So these hormones that get that surge into the body, they temporarily stun the heart muscle. And then the left ventricle changes shape and it stops contracting normally. And well, you might say, well, what triggers this, right? Like I said, it's an emotional thing. So a trigger can be a sudden grief, loss, severe emotional shock, intense fear or conflict. I remember a family that my family knew, and there was a man. He was a grandfather, and he had this granddaughter. It was a very close bond. It was very beautiful, and I think the child only trusted him, and he was always there for that little girl. And I believe from the stories I remember, he passed away at some point, and the little girl, she actually had broken heart syndrome. Okay, so that extreme stress, that grief of not seeing her grandfather anymore, it affected her so much. She ended up actually passing away as well. I think it was 2 weeks after her grandfather died, but a week or two, something like that. So it is a real thing. I mean, that was a child, but so yeah, so things like grief can definitely create that syndrome, right? Some of the symptoms you might feel if you have something like this are sudden chest pain or shortness of breath. If I were to look at your ECG, I could see a heart rhythm that looks like you are actually having a heart attack. So, ST elevation for those who know, or ST depression, or T wave inversion, you'll actually see that on the ECG. Blood work will show increased cardiac enzymes, but if you get an angiogram, it's normal. The coronary arteries are absolutely fine. Apparently, it's usually reversible, and heart function returns to normal within days to weeks, and patients recover fully with supportive care. I will say, in all the years that I worked in that field specifically, cardiology, I don't think I've ever had a patient. Actually, maybe I had one so long ago though, but I don't think it's definitely rare, right? Like, it's not patients that we get all the time, but if anything, I may have had possibly one patient that I took care of. So, being me, I wanted to know the ejection fraction of these patients. I mean, if the left ventricle isn't working properly, well, what is the ejection fraction, right? Is what some of you are thinking. I'm just thinking in terms of what I already know. So EF, or ejection fraction, is the amount of blood that's being pushed, right, because of the ventricles. So a normal EF, or a normal ejection fraction, would be about 55 to 70%. But with this broken heart syndrome, it drops apparently to 20 to 45%. That's really low. I remember taking care of a man that his EF was, I think it was 30, 35%. He was very sick. He had multiple issues, but my goodness, he was so pale. He was very weak. And so, I can imagine if it goes down to 20%, I mean, you're not moving, you're not really doing much. So that ejection fraction you will see that drop in the EF probably minutes to hours after the stress trigger, and the heart wall abnormalities can appear possibly within 30 minutes. And then the left ventricle can develop atypical ballooning. The stress hormones, they temporarily paralyze parts of the heart muscle. And then there's this myocardial toxicity due to the sudden catecholamine surge, or the stress hormone surge. Then there's calcium overload in the heart cells. You get microvascular spasms and a temporary stunning of the heart muscle. This whole situation that occurs, it's not gradual. It's not like you'll feel like you're getting worse over the hours. This is acute, okay? So it happens very quickly. But apparently EF can return to normal within around 4 to 8 weeks, which is still quite long, like 2 months, 1 to 2 months. That's still a long time. So when seeking evidence-based research on the wounded heart, just know, if you're going to go do this and do your own research, don't type in the wounded heart, because you're not going to find anything, right? You want to be typing in things like social pain after breakup, relationship breakup, or you might want to look for attachment insecurity. That's where you'll find the plethora of research that's been done. And I will share some of what I found. I mean, I don't have time anymore to read loads of these research studies. I just don't. So I take what I think might help me understand more, like maybe the top 5 that I'm finding within the last 5 years. But if anyone knows of any others that I don't mention that are important, please write them down in the description and share it with everybody. And as I've done in the past now with my creative stories, I have another creative story. Hopefully it helps those listening understand from a different perspective of living in our time and maybe experiencing some of these issues. Jack had been with her for years, long enough that the shape of the relationship felt familiar, even when it hurt. Not loud hurt, not dramatic. The kind that settles into the body and becomes background noise. She often told him he was distant, that he thought too much, that he made things heavier than they needed to be. He didn't know how to explain that depth wasn't a choice for him, that silence wasn't absence, that when he paused, it wasn't because he didn't care, it was because he did. What she wanted was immediacy. What he offered was presence. They never learned how to translate. When it ended, there was no explosion, just a quiet agreement that something essential wasn't being met. Still, he felt the loss more than he expected. Not because the relationship had been good, but because it had been known, predictable, contained. Even its toxicity had rules. Comfort, he realized, can masquerade as attachment. In the weeks after, he kept himself busy. Work, routine, order. He told himself he was fine, and mostly he was. But sometimes, late at night, a strange guilt surfaced, as if leaving meant he had failed at something, as if staying longer might have made it work. That was when he noticed her. Not in a dramatic way, just a presence that didn't demand attention, but held it. She spoke carefully, listened fully, didn't rush her words or fill silence. What he felt was something quieter, a sense of calm, a lowering of his guard. And that unsettled him. He wondered if she would find him too reserved, too slow, too serious. He wondered if she would misunderstand his pauses the way others had, mistaking consideration for detachment, restraint for disinterest. He thought about speaking to her, then thought about the consequences of doing so. Because for him, connection was never casual. Words mattered. Openings carried weight. He didn't step forward unless he could stand there. So he waited. Not out of fear, but out of respect. For himself, for her, for the unknown shape of what might follow. And somewhere between familiarity and possibility, between comfort and risk, he remained, still deciding what responsibility he was ready to choose. Some of you listening may understand this short story from the perspective of the main character, Jack, or from the partner he inevitably had to leave. Or maybe you're the third character that shows up at the end, someone who may or may not even notice that you've got someone's attention. So when we talk about the wounded heart, okay, in psychological science, there's, like I said earlier, there's no official diagnostic category for what we call the wounded heart, as it's a metaphor that describes that intense emotional pain that can arise from deep relational injury, things like romantic loss, betrayal, attachment ruptures, or trauma in close bonds. What do I mean by attachment ruptures? So when a child's expectations of safety, responsiveness, or emotional availability from a caregiver is broken, either repeatedly or during a highly distressing moment, attachment ruptures can occur. So yes, we are going back into childhood because isn't that where everything starts? Isn't that where we learn, right? Now that definition comes from attachment theory research that was initiated by John Bowlby and later on Mary Ainsworth. So they, discovered things like from 0 to 2 years, if a baby is left to cry or the parent or caregiver maybe leave without saying goodbye, like, when some parents drop their kids off at daycare, they're too afraid to go and say goodbye because the child might cry. Well, that creates an attachment rupture, doesn't it? How would you feel if you were that kid? Or emotional expression is punished, if you're a child, if you're always told to stop crying, this shows that love is conditional on emotional suppression. Or if there's inconsistent caregiving, like a parent is unpredictable due to stress or maybe a mental illness, this becomes what we call anxious attachment. Or maybe the parent turns a child into emotional support. The child is the one comforting the parent and mediating conflict. The parent, shares adult emotional burdens on the child. So the child is learning, my needs are dangerous and I must take care of others to be loved. Now, if we get into like the older kids and into the teens, if there's a betrayal of trust, for example, like a child shares something private with a parent or caregiver, and that caregiver goes and tells others, that's obviously a betrayal of trust. What about if a parent sides with an abuser? What if a child goes to one of the parents and says, listen, this is what they did to me? And that parent just refuses to believe them. That's extremely damaging. It minimizes the child's pain. It damages trust and emotional safety. Then you've got things like chronic criticism and conditional approval. I think I used to see this a lot in my high school. We had a lot of athletes. A lot of them came from wealthy backgrounds, and their parents, mainly the dads, expected them to do very well. Those kids learn that love only happens when you're achieving something, or affection is tied to performance. One thing I hate is comparisons to the sibling. I do not like that. That creates shame-based attachment. So there's this fear of failure, there's perfectionism that comes out of these experiences. Now, if the caregiver is both a source of comfort and fear, so for example, there's domestic violence or emotional volatility, maybe verbal abuse, or maybe substance abuse, the nervous system for that child, they're receiving conflicting signals, and it tells the kid that the one I need is the one who frightens me, and it creates this what they call attachment disorganization. Now, what's really bad as well is if there's no repair after rupture. So caregivers rupture connection after the trauma when they don't apologize. There's no reassurance. There's no type of emotional repair. But what is repair, right? So that's basically acknowledging the harm that they've done, naming the emotion, reestablishing safety. What happens to those children as they get older, when they become adults? How does that manifest? Well, you've got fear of abandonment. There's emotional shutdown, hyper independence, and then there's difficulty trusting others. And a lot of times there's an attraction to emotionally unavailable partners. Now, some of you listening to this, you may already know some of these issues that you possibly have. Some of you might still be figuring this out. When you look at the research kind of brings up things like social pain, how like emotional rejection and breakups, lead to real distress. The research talks about attachment injuries, how insecure attachment creates heightened distress when important relationships are unstable. So we will kind of go into some of those studies, but I will probably just focus on one briefly. So you have to understand, even though there's been a lot of research in this realm, there isn't going to be a simple cure for this deep emotional pain that some of us carry that stems from childhood. But research does show that there are ways to help recover from relational hurt, which I'm going to kind of get into. So some of the attachment-based therapies that have come up from this research, they do help with improving trust and emotional regulation, increasing secure attachment and healing emotional injuries. But, you have to remember that just because they've done this, it doesn't erase the hurt, but it does help to build or rebuild trust over time, to help regulate your emotions and reduce distress over time. I want to go over two definitions before I continue. Something called attachment insecurity. Well, what does that mean? They are patterns of attachment characterized by anxiety about abandonment or avoidance of intimacy. And that arises when attachment figures are perceived as unreliable or unavailable. And that comes from Attachment in Adulthood, Structure, Dynamics, and Change by McVilnser and Shaver. And then there's attachment avoidance. That's characterized by discomfort with emotional closeness, or suppression of vulnerability. There's also excessive self-reliance, emotional distancing, and distrust of dependence. That was attachment avoidance. So just try to keep that in mind. Those definitions, they're important. Now, there's a study that I just wanted to go over. There's loads of studies. You can, I'm going to probably put links to some of these in the description, but one of them is called Attachment and Breakup Distress, the Mediating Role of Coping Strategies. That was published in Emerging Adulthood in 2024, a peer-reviewed psychology journal. And they studied how attachment insecurity before a romantic breakup predicts emotional distress after the breakup. And they specifically looked at depressive and anxiety symptoms. And over time, they looked at whether this happens through the coping strategies that people use. The participants were, I think it was 196 young adults, so roughly 18 to 25 years of age, who recently experienced a romantic breakup. So what they looked at was coping strategies like self-help, approach or problem solving, accommodation, meaning like acceptance or positive reframing. They looked at coping strategies of avoidance, like denial or distraction, and then self-punishment. So again, the study measured attachment style before the breakup. Okay, it assessed coping strategies 1 month after the breakup, and it measured emotional distress at 1 month and 3 months after the breakup. And what they found was attachment insecurity predicts breakup distress. So both attachment anxiety and avoidance before the breakup were linked to higher depressive and anxiety symptoms after the breakup. And when they looked at coping strategies to help mediate the emotional impact, they looked at self-punishment coping. So people with higher attachment anxiety or avoidance were more likely to ruminate, engage in self-critical thinking after the breakup. That's self-punishment coping, which is linked strongly to higher depression and anxiety. And they found that happened at both 1 month and 3 months after breakup. There was also a lower accommodation coping. So those same attachment insecurities were linked to less use of acceptance and positive reframing. So less of the adaptive coping was associated with higher depressive symptoms. So there was more self-punishment, less accommodation following the breakup. So their findings kind of show us how that attachment insecurity makes the emotional system vulnerable to relational loss. And when these events happen, these distressing events like a breakup, the types of coping strategies people use, especially how much they blame themselves instead of just accepting the loss, reframing it, moving on, they help determine how deeply and how long that distress persists. That insecure attachment that leads to rumination and self-blame are strong predictors of prolonged emotional suffering. So the research shows a process, these attachment patterns that influence people and how they cope. And those thoughts and coping styles predict the emotional pain over time. You'll see some people that after a breakup, they're still like a year later, still thinking about that person, like they may have done something wrong. But I mean, how were they before emotionally? You have to remember that study that I'm speaking of, this specific study, it only focused on young adults. It didn't look at older adults or any diverse age groups. So, thinking about that, different decades of our life, we're going through different things, right? Like every 7 years, you're in a different developmental stage, you're in a different life stage, physically, mentally, spiritually, okay? So when you're looking at young adults, of course, things are going to be magnified. They're still learning, okay? They have to go through these experiences. When you're talking about people in their 30s, 40s, 50s, some of us have been through these things already. We've had the experience, the practice. And hopefully some of us have learned how to deal with these issues that when they come up. I just want to go over the 4 primary attachment patterns. So there's the secure attachment that develops when a caregiver is consistently responsive and emotionally available. And the child then learns that they can trust others and ask for help, and that if they are distressed, they can be soothed. And later on in life, when they're an adult, they appear as secure individuals that usually have healthier emotional regulation and more trusting relationships. The second attachment pattern would be anxious attachment. So that would develop when a caregiver responds in an unpredictable way. Sometimes they're supportive, sometimes they're not. And then the child learns they cannot count on consistency of that person because they don't know if they're going to get soothed, right? So later on, they become highly vigilant to signs of rejection. There's rumination. There's a strong fear of abandonment. And they have difficulty calming their emotional stress. And that pattern is common in individuals whose wounded heart hurts intensely with relationship loss or uncertainty. Then you have avoidant attachment, which develops when caregivers are consistently unresponsive, dismissive, or emotionally unavailable. And so the child learns they're going to handle things alone because close connections are not reliable. And then that emotional pattern later on becomes emotional distancing, suppressing vulnerability, difficulty trusting other people, and then just a tendency to rely on yourself because there's nobody that's going to be there to do it for you, right? So the wounded heart here may show an emotional shutdown or avoidance of closeness. And then you have disorganized attachment, which will develop when the caregivers are frightening or chaotic or abusive. So that same source of comfort also induces fear. And in the child, learns that help is unpredictable and it's possibly really dangerous. And then later on in adulthood, they have difficulty regulating emotions. There's confusion about closeness versus safety. And there's a higher risk for trauma-related patterns. And that usually shows in people with complex relational trauma histories. So these internal maps, these working models that are created in children, these kids form these models of relationships, okay? And they're learned very early on, and they shape expectations in future relationships with romantic partners, friends, caregivers, even therapists. And there have been studies that show how this insecure attachment relates to heightened stress responses, altered emotional processing when, they're threatened socially. And it's just how the brain has learned to process safety and threats in relationships. So as I'm reading through all of this, I'm thinking to myself, can these be changed? Can these attachment patterns be changed? And the answer is yes. They can shift across life, especially when you have supportive relationships, whether that's romantic partners or friends that you can trust. I'd be very careful with friends. You better trust them. And then, of course, therapy. Also corrective emotional experiences. So there have been studies that support, or research that supports, that these attachment styles, people can become more secure with healing relationships. So if you have what you would call the wounded heart, we already know that comes from what we experienced in our early years, right? Whether there was inconsistency, absence, or harm. And those internal working models experience that insecurity. Um, as a child, that emotional regulation learned that there was threat, not safety. And then relational loss triggers neural systems that are attached to this distress, right? So when we talk about the wounded heart, I mean, the pain that you're feeling, it's tied to neural and emotional systems that were shaped in our early experiences, right? So how do these attachment wounds heal? And looking through, evidence-based research and psychology, you cannot just heal these attachment wounds with insight. So it's like, okay, you figured out that you've got an attachment wound. Just knowing it isn't going to heal it. Okay. These things heal through repeated emotional experiences of safety, regulation, and repair, especially in relationships. There are many people now, especially with all the information around us, whether they're books or just use of the internet, or channels on YouTube that discuss all these things. Some of us have figured out, some of the issues we have through all of these avenues, but understanding that hurt is, you're still going to feel the wound, but it's at least a start, right? You're going in the right direction. You're naming it. Those patterns that you have are encoded within you. They're stored in emotional regulation systems. So what I found is that there are 3 evidence-based pillars of healing for attachment wounds. The first is co-regulation or self-regulation. So what that means is the early attachment wounds form when you're a child. If they couldn't be soothed by the caregiver, okay, healing would require experiencing regulation with another person before that internal regulation even becomes possible. So secure attachment develops when the caregivers repeatedly help children regulate distress. And as an adult, healing insecure attachment happens through co-regulating relationships, whether that's through therapy or close relationships. You would need somebody, if you're in a close relationship, that really understands how this all works and is patient. Attachment wounds heal first between people, not in isolation. So that's kind of important, because they were created between people, right? Then there's pillar 2, so corrective emotional experiences. What does that mean? It means healing occurs when a person expects abandonment, rejection, or emotional unavailability, but instead they experience attunement, repair, or reliability. And that creates a mismatch between the old expectations and a new reality. And that can update that attachment model that they have within. And there has been research that shows that attachment and security can increase over time, but through supportive relationships and therapy. So if you're somebody that does experience that, you're going to hopefully, like I said earlier, you're going to hopefully need or have somebody that really understands this, if you're in a close relationship, to be patient with you. And it's work, right? It's work, and it takes time. Then there's pillar 3, repair, not perfection. So you have to remember, it's very important. Secure attachment, gaining that, is not about never being hurt again. It's about, there's a rupture, there's acknowledgement, and then there's repair. Securely attached relationships, they include conflict, but repairing them restores safety. If you have a chronic lack of repairing the rupture, it's going to predict attachment insecurity. So what heals the wounded heart is not never being hurt, but being met after being hurt. So let's say you're in a relationship and you have an argument about something, and it's heated. It is a heated argument. What are you going to do? Well, one person's going to probably walk away. The other one wants to face it head on and deal with it now so it doesn't fester and they can move on. But that doesn't always happen. At some point, whether it's figuring out that there was a miscommunication, a misunderstanding, somebody's got to come back and try to repair that. And say, listen, I think there was a miscommunication or a misunderstanding, and this is what I really meant. This is why this happened. And the other person should also step up and say, I understand now. I'm sorry for getting so upset. Let's try this next time, have some type of a plan, a repair. If you keep having these arguments without any repair, of course it's not going to end well. And sometimes you won't be able to just try to heal these wounds with just relational assistance. I mean, you could use therapy, right? So things like emotionally focused therapy. There's strong evidence that is designed specifically to repair adult attachment bonds. And there has been it's been shown that there's been improvement in attachment security and relationship satisfaction. So if you think therapy is something that could assist with what you're already doing, that might be a good option. There's somatic approaches. From the study that we looked at earlier, the 2024 breakup study, we looked at how there was attachment insecurity that led to distress through coping strategies, and that the healing would therefore involve reducing self-punishment and rumination, and increasing acceptance-based coping. Okay? The wounded heart will hurt longer when pain turns inward as self-attack. Just remember that. And then another question came up. Can attachment wounds heal without a romantic partner? Yes, they can, but not without relationship. Like I said earlier, they began with relationship, these where they came from, right? So healing can occur through, like I said, a therapist, maybe close friendships. Be careful with that one, because sometimes people can use things against you in the future, but maybe you have safe community relationships. And there has to be consistent relational experiences. And there is evidence that shows that earned secure attachment can develop later in life through non-parental relationships. You won't be able to do this just with affirmations and visualizations. Those things do help, okay? And insight. Those things will help, but there needs to be more than that. So just to kind of put it all together, we know that psychology doesn't define a wounded heart as a diagnosis, but there is research that shows that deep emotional pain usually or often comes from attachment injuries, those disruptions in early relationships or important relationships. And those wounds heal not just through insight alone, but through repeated emotional experiences of safety, co-regulation, and repair. And some of these studies do show that attachment styles can change over time through supportive relationships and evidence-based therapy. And that allows the nervous system to relearn trust. Now, if we look at Carl Jung, he didn't use the term wounded heart either. He had something else he called a complex. So, like, what is a complex, right? And he describes it as an emotionally charged cluster of memories, images, beliefs, organized around a core wound or conflict. And they can be activated when triggered. And he described these complexes as having kind of an autonomous nature, like they take over consciousness temporarily. And he identified 4 psychological functions. So there's thinking, feeling, sensation, intuition. And apparently relational trauma primarily injures the feeling function. And now that feeling function governs things like value, attachment, emotional meaning, and relational worth. So when the feeling function is wounded early on, the psyche, the unconscious and the conscious, learns that closeness equals danger or abandonment or loss of self. When emotional pain is too overwhelming, the psyche does something adaptive. It represses vulnerability, it splits off grief, longing, dependency, rage. And remember what happens when you have these disowned aspects, they fall into the shadow. And then that results in a person appearing like they are strong, independent, controlled, but they carry an unconscious fear of intimacy or abandonment. So, from Carl Jung's perspective, the more painful the wound is, the more likely it is to be hidden in the shadow. And sometimes this can explain why wounded hearts often will repeat the same relational patterns, or choose unavailable partners, or maybe sabotage closeness. And there's this seesaw of going between longing and withdrawal, because that shadow, it's in the unconscious, right? So you're not going to realize, why do I end up in the same situation? If we look at the anima and the animus, and injuries and romantic pain, remember the anima is the inner feminine in the men, and the animus is within the woman, the inner masculine. So for a man, if they have a wounded anima, they may experience intense longing, despair after rejection, idealization of women. And for the woman, a wounded animus, they may experience inner criticism, mistrust of men, emotional withdrawal or defensiveness. Now, I mean, we can have both, right? As a man, you may have an inner criticism, it can go both ways. So according to Carl Jung and all the work he's done, there's this sense of healing doesn't mean becoming unfeeling. It means becoming whole. You have to integrate the shadow. He never used the term wounded heart, right? But he did describe that same situation through what he calls complexes. And that these wounds can form autonomous emotional structures that shape how we love, fear, and attach. And these wounds often live in the shadow, and we project them onto other people and create this pattern, this repeated pattern. And the healing is not about completely erasing the pain, because that doesn't work, but it's about integrating it through consciousness, relationship, and meaning. So individuation. So we could look at the alchemical process of how to work through the wounded heart. You have something called prima materia, something that exists before form, structure, or identity. Prima materia, it's not a physical substance. It exists everywhere and nowhere at once. It is chaotic, dark, emotionally charged, unwanted, yet essential. When we talk about the wounded heart, we talk about grief, abandonment, betrayal, right? If we look at the first stage of alchemy, the blackening, nigredo, that's the darkness, the decomposition, loss of former identity, despair or confusion. And that corresponds to heartbreak or depression, or the collapse of old relational illusions. That moment where you cannot pretend that you're fine. And even if you say you're fine, people can clearly see you're not. The acting doesn't work anymore. And many people in this stage, it's where they try to escape. But if you try to avoid nigredo, the first stage, it will prevent your transformation. So you cannot bypass this stage without psychological cost. So in this stage, maybe you want to name the emotions without trying to interpret them. So like, saying, this is grief I'm feeling. Don't say I'm broken. Just name the emotion. Give yourself time to grieve. If you find that you're ruminating a lot or you're grieving a lot, give yourself time-limited grieving. Say, listen, from this time to this time, I'm going to journal and I'm going to allow myself to feel that. Maybe you want to try therapy, or maybe you have a safe relationship with someone where pain is met. It's not solved. It's named. It's met. That's co-regulation, right? Attachment repair. Don't think you can try to just manifest pain away. It's not going to work like that. Then you have albedo, the whitening, the purification, the washing away of confusion. This is where your psyche begins to differentiate what was you and what was projected, what belongs to your wound and what's actually happening. This is where you can say, this pain I'm feeling, it's old. And some of the things that you can possibly do are projection work. Identify patterns, name triggers without shaming yourself. Maybe you want to create boundary formation or emotional and relational limits. Be clear about what you can or cannot carry in a relationship. So, for example, not absorbing somebody else's emotions, not over-explaining your feelings, like trying to convince someone your feelings are valid. Do you know how exhausting that gets? Or pausing in a conversation because maybe you think it's becoming unsafe or it's overwhelming. You're allowed to ask for that. Hopefully the other person can understand, and if they can't, well, that tells you a lot, doesn't it? Maybe choosing to communicate, like limit how long emotional pain occupies your mental space. You cannot go all day with that pain in mind. Have limits, of your availability. You also have citronitis, so the yellowing. That stage is what brings restored agency, warmth returning to life. Your values are clarified through your suffering. Ask yourself, what is this pain shaping me into? This is where your wound can become informative and not overwhelming. You can take that wound and say, what did I learn about love or limits or truth? This is also where your values are clarified. Ask yourself, who am I now because I've survived this, whatever that is? And also, what will you no longer tolerate? And another thing you can do is creative expression. So if you love music, listen to music. Doesn't matter if it's classical, heavy metal. Music really does help. Maybe you want to write, whether it's in your journal or write a story, write a book. Art is another one. If you want to paint, try painting, sculpture. I don't know if anyone's tried wet on wet watercolor painting. It's beautiful. If you think you're not a good artist, try wet on wet watercolor painting. Whatever you paint is going to turn out absolutely gorgeous. Then you have rubedo, the reddening, the union of opposites, wholeness. So returning to life with depth. So this is where you have a capacity to love without fusion or avoidance. Your heart is no longer armored, but it is no longer naive either. And in this stage, you're able to repair instead of retreat, right? This is where you can also learn to use breath or grounding, nervous system awareness. This is the point where you get that alchemical gold, not perfection, but presence. You get to the point where you say, can I love deeply and still remain whole? That's important. You don't want to lose yourself in another person. But just remember, this is very important. Healing or trying to heal, it doesn't remove the wound. It changes our relationship to it, allowing us to love without illusion and having intimacy without self-destruction. So there's this thing I've been saying to myself quite a lot lately, like to myself in my head. Um, Kind of like a secret thing I say, but I really don't care. I can share it. Um, so like my image of I guess, a perfect partner, right? I call him my um, King Arthur. So it's an archetype, right? King Arthur. And I thought, well, let me figure out while I'm doing this research on this episode, why did I choose King Arthur? I mean, to me, it's pretty simple, but I wanted to go deeper into it. Um, and I guess I'm saying when I use the archetype of King Arthur, it's I'm oriented towards a very specific form of masculine order, ethics, and restraint. Um, King Arthur is somebody that I see as accepting responsibility reluctantly. He's bound by oath and code. Um, and I just find that my psyche, I guess, is oriented towards that. So, the sword and the stone, that's about recognition. Arthur becomes king not because he wants to, but because he's the only one who can draw the sword. The sword responds to inner alignment, not force. Like he literally just pulled it out, not even trying. So, what does that all mean? Because then I went into this deeper, right? I What does that mean to me? He's able to pull the sword without even trying too hard like everybody else, like his stepbrother. I guess it means the right partner won't need convincing. He will recognize the moment. So my psyche selected that image of King Arthur that integrates love and duty, or romance and responsibility. Um, it's definitely a very specific quality of masculinity that I guess I have in my mind. Um, and King Arthur is a man who knows what he's responsible for. He chooses it. He places duty and ethics and consequence above gratification. He chooses responsibility. He doesn't seek the crown, he accepts it. So I did figure out I am not drawn to people that avoid responsibility or resent obligation. I am definitely drawn to people or individuals that choose responsibility freely and then carry it without complaint. And then there's the leadership, um, leadership that includes counsel. This is important. In the day and age we live in, I know a lot of people are all about, well, we're equals. Well, that's great that you're equals, but I do not mind a man who leads. I prefer it. I don't mind it. But with me standing beside him as queen, right? Like if we're using that Arthurian theme. So that archetype um, is more aligned with things like they lead decisively, they consult their queen, um, they value wisdom over dominance, and they understand that counsel strengthens rule. This is not about equality being sameness. Okay, there's a hierarchy with mutual respect. Um, I don't see King Arthur as promiscuous or flirtatious. If you've got somebody in your life that flirts with people all the time, that's a problem with me. I don't know how everybody else feels. Or if there is somebody that's constantly trying to be flirtatious with that one person, and that person doesn't stop that, that's a problem too. Now, King Arthur, his downfall was Guinevere and Lancelot. I never liked Guinevere anyway. Um, It's tragic because it violates the code, right? These are things that are non-negotiable. Sexuality is bonded to loyalty for some of us. Intimacy has consequence, and that the person's desire, or whoever the um, King Arthur is, their desire is not scattered. There's a quiet strength that I guess I seek. And King Arthur isn't just a man. He's not just a king. He's a king of something, that realm that can be work, mission, values, family, legacy. If you're still trying to, for me, I can only speak for myself. If you're still trying to form your purpose, that's not good enough at this point. It depends on your age too. Like, how old are you? um, somebody that already has a direction or structure, responsibility, they don't have to have all the answers, but what is your realm? What's your mission? I definitely think that the King Arthur archetype helps me kind of guide me to look for or to recognize a man who can lead while still recognizing me as a sovereign role beside him. That queen king polarity. In medieval symbolism, the king directs the outer realm. The queen governs continuity and lineage, and the decisions are strongest when they are both aligned. I'm not saying I'm waiting for perfection or a rescue. That's definitely not what I'm seeking. Um, but a man whose authority is clean enough that I can rest beside it, that I can stand beside it. And I know some of you are thinking, wow, who do you think you are? That is a very high standard. It is very rare, I'm sure. But at this point in my life, that is what I guess I'm guided to recognize. Um, and probably won't go for anything less than that. Like I said, it's a high standard, but we'll see. So, in my mind, King Arthur is he commits to the realm. Okay, he builds a kingdom, or he wants to build a kingdom, um, and he understands that partnership strengthens rule. He carries the code of the king. Um, when you're in relationships, there has to be an understanding on both parts. There's things like time boundaries. Like, I sat down after kind of looking at this King Arthur archetype, and I wrote down like boundaries that I have, and that's something that you can do as well. When you go through a wounded heart um, period of time, at some point you're going to say, these are my non-negotiables. What are my boundaries? One of the boundaries I have is the time boundary. For women, it may be a little more serious than for men. Especially if you want to have children, like, how long are you going to wait for that man to say that they're ready before you can have children? And then what has to happen before that, before you even have a child, right? There has to be a respect of time on both sides. Don't plan your life around a maybe. A man choosing the crown understands that time is meaningful, not neutral. And then there's the effort boundary. How much are you putting in? Are you carrying everything on your own, all the momentum? Are you the one that initiates everything? Are you the only one keeping the conversations alive? And then there's the responsibility boundary. I know I wrote down that I will not merge my life with someone who has not chosen responsibility. It has to happen on both sides, right? It what it means is it's a willing to discuss responsibility, not recoil from it. And if the other person frames it as commitment as loss, that's a problem. If responsibility is always treated or framed as a threat, that's a values issue. And then there's the access boundary. So making sure you don't overshare too early. Sharing your depth with someone who has stepped forward, not someone just standing at the gate. So I have to, this boundary for myself is to stop oversharing too early. How much depth can you share with the other person? Then there's a vision boundary. Are you going to downsize your life vision to fit someone else's hesitation? That includes marriage, stability, family, shared home, legacy. This is where, you have to remind yourself, because I've seen so many people easily pulled into this where they downsize their visions because of somebody else not wanting to make the next step. And that's fine, that's their decision. But then what are you doing to yourself? This is going to be the rest of your life? Or maybe it's not. Maybe you're going to continue on that journey of downsizing yourself to fit someone else's story. And then somewhere in the future, they decide that, well, they've had enough of you. And then what do you have left? There's a lot to think about. And always remember that you have to see it from both sides. You have to understand different perspectives and who's involved, right? So for me, the vision boundary of not downsizing my life, the vision of my future life is, I do not want to demand alignment. I have to observe whether it exists or there's a potential for it. And of course, that comes with discussion with the other person. A man who wants the crown doesn't ask you to dream smaller. The man that is crowned, the archetype of King Arthur, for me, he initiates without being pushed. He acknowledges the weight of partnership and chooses it. He doesn't disappear when responsibility is mentioned. He doesn't frame commitment as pressure. For myself and the archetype I've used or chosen, I need to see that he is willing to rule the realm with me beside him. Now, this is going to be different for everybody, right? I have that extreme archetype that I've chosen that is very rare to find, as far as I can see. You have to remember these archetypes, you're allowed to hold them before life is tidy. This doesn't mean that I'm perfect, okay, because I'm not. But these archetypes, the one that I hold, it's a guide, it's a direction. That's all. So that when that individual shows up, you acknowledge that they have these traits that you look up to and that you admire. In the myth of King Arthur, the kingdom is not ordered when he appears. The land is broken, the sword is hidden, and the court does not yet exist. And Arthur becomes king before the realm is stable, not after. So for me, that archetype doesn't mean that there's going to be perfection, okay, or completion. It's an orientation towards responsibility, even in unfinished conditions. For people who've learned early that love comes with cost, the heart doesn't open to intensity, it opens to integrity. And to someone who knows what they are responsible for and chooses it. I don't know, what do you think of that archetype I've chosen? It's been a little secret of mine, but it is one that I thought I'd look into a bit more and try to understand. But what do you think of the archetype of King Arthur? And whoever's listening to this, do you have an archetype that you kind of hold as like what you would hope for in a partner, a future partner? Share it with me. I'd love to know your thoughts. It might be a fun thing to try that. Think of someone you admire that you would be grateful for if they were a part of your future, the one you grow old with. If anything in this episode stirred emotion, memory, or recognition, it's not a sign that something's wrong with you. It is a sign that your system was listening. The wounded heart isn't proof that we loved incorrectly. It's evidence that connection mattered to us. Attachment wounds don't form because we're weak. They form because we are human, dependent, and shaped in relationship. And healing doesn't happen all at once. That is so important. It happens slowly through awareness, through safer connections, through rupture and repair, and through learning how to stay present with ourselves instead of abandoning who we are. And the archetypes that we're drawn to, whether that's the healer, the protector, the king, they're not predictions of who will come into our life. They are mirrors. They show us the values our nervous system longs to feel: safety, consistency, emotional maturity, respect, devotion, care. Those qualities are not meant to be waited for. They are meant to be cultivated within us. Because the deeper truth is that the wounded heart does not need to be fixed. It needs to be met. And when it is met with compassion instead of criticism, it often starts to soften. It's good to reflect on these things. I have created a downloadable worksheet to help explore some of this if you're interested. And, getting down on paper sometimes what your heart has been trying to protect and not judging yourself through that. I would advise to take your time with it, just like healing. Healing takes time. Take your time with these worksheets. I have I have a few of them now that I've shared for free. But take your time with the worksheets. There's no rush, okay? Transformation is not a race. It's remembering, okay? And the healing will happen eventually, slowly. And that pain that you feel right there in the middle, it will not completely disappear, but we can help it along. Thank you for joining me today for this episode. I hope it's helped understand and shed some light on the wounded heart and what it really means, and how some of us can deal with and start to heal. Please do share your stories. Share what you've done to try to get through life. Share your tips and tricks if you are somebody that's worked through this already or works with people that get through this. Again, thank you for stepping into the portal. Take care.